All right. Welcome to this episode of Phototheology. I'm your host, Doug, and today we are going to have another exciting episode of Phototheology. Or hopefully we do. I don't know. We'll find out as we get into it. So today what we're going to be talking about primarily is sensors and sensor technology. For me, it's a pretty big topic. It's something that I heavily ingrain myself on when it comes to digital cameras or when it comes to just essentially digital imagery. Imaging processors and sensors are in the end game what it's all about. And anybody who tells you differently is full of crap. Okay, they're completely full of crap. If you cannot replicate the image that you need to have replicated, then it doesn't matter at all. And there are two parts to this. There is the capturing system, and then there's the processing of what's been captured. And that's where your sensor and your effectively imaging processor comes into play. Now, I don't want people to get this confused with camera features. Okay, I don't want people to do that. Okay, so like in this episode, we're not talking about, frames per second. We're not necessarily talking about autofocusing speeds. We're not talking about those kinds of things. Okay, we're not talking about mechanics. What we're talking about is the ability to essentially see subject matter and then reduplicate that subject matter through a digital format that is beholden to the intended subject in its natural given form. So when we look at this for what it is, this is one of the things that really blows my mind is sensor and sensor technology. Because really when you talk about digital camera manufacturers, there are two types of digital camera manufacturers that essentially exist. Those who are sensor-based manufacturers. In other words, they develop a camera, but also in addition to developing a camera, they develop the core guts of the camera, or they are beholden to their image quality. In other words, they're able to further the narrative when it actually comes to image quality. And then you have other camera manufacturers who essentially use other people's stuff inside their camera. They slap their name on it, and pretty much about the only thing they do is develop a lens. Okay, that's about it. Now, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to see where I'm going with this, okay? So, for example, all right, you take Sony. Sony is essentially, at this point in the game, perceived as the largest sensor manufacturer of camera and camcorders in the given market. Okay, Sony, I believe at this point, because they just bought Toshiba, so I would say they probably own about 60%, probably even more than that, because before they bought Toshiba, they had over 40%. But I would say about maybe 60% of the camera market and camcorder market is beholden to Sony in terms of sensor technology. And Sony has done some pretty amazing things. The first thing is this, is right from the get-go, Sony was developing sensors for digital cameras in a way that made a lot of sense. And one of the reasons to why I've always found this to be fascinating is that sensor technology originally didn't start with Sony. When it came to digital cameras, it started with Kodak. And, of course, for those who know who Kodak is, because a lot of people now, you mention the name Kodak, and they would just, be like deers in headlights. They wouldn't even know what the hell you're talking about now when it comes to digital cameras. Because a lot of people don't even know that Kodak was in the digital camera business for the longest. And now they're trying to make a comeback, but I don't know how that's going to work out. But, to the point of what I'm going after here, the very first digital SLR that was ever made, I believe it was the very first digital SLR ever made, was a conjunction between Kodak and Nikon. And Kodak said that the digital camera was never going to work. You know, it was just never going to work. Kodak just didn't believe that the digital camera / the digital SLR theory could work in a consumer market. And the reason for it was huge, you know, it was bulky compared to traditional cameras. You didn't have the same response times and things like that. And when you compared image quality and stuff like that, of course, it just wasn't there. Okay, it just wasn't there. Now, what happened was technology just got better. You know, you got to remember that at one point in time in the computer industry, like literally, the speed of computer processors was essentially doubling every single year. You know, or it felt like that at least. So just to give you an idea of how computers have changed in the past, we'll say 10 to 15 years. You know, at one point when computers hit the consumer market where people were buying real computers, you were talking about a 133 megahertz Intel Pentium processor. Then it jumped to a 166. Then it jumped to a 200. Then it jumped to a 200 with MMX technology. Then it jumped to an Intel Pentium 2. Then it jumped to an Intel Pentium 3. Then it jumped to an Intel Pentium 4. Then it jumped to, you know, an Intel Pentium with hyper-threading or whatever they called it. And then eventually you worked your way up into what the current, you know, day i3, i5, and i7 is. You know, that's where you're at right now. Now, the reason why I bring this into the conversation is because when I talk about these jumps, primarily what I gave you were classes of processors. That's what I did. But more importantly than that, you got to keep in mind there were megahertz in between there. And those megahertz determine the speeds of the processor classes that you had going on. Like how I talked about originally, you had the 133 to the 166 to the 200. Well, you know, at some point, you know, you get to 400 megahertz, then you get to 500 megahertz, you know, then you get to 600 megahertz, and then somewhere in there, you get to, 900. Then you get to like 1,000 or a gigahertz. Then you get like a 1.2. Then somehow you get to a 1.8. And then, you know, in today's market, you have processors that go, I believe, as fast as 4,000 and on up. Gigahertz. That's how they are now. And on top of that, they're multi-core. So way back when, it used to be when you purchased a computer, you had one central core processor. Now when you go into a retail store and you want to buy a computer, you can get a computer that has anywhere from 2 to 8, typically, central core processors. In fact, when you look at your cell phone, you look at your premium cell phones, your premium cell phones will be octa-core processors, meaning that they'll have 8 processors in them. And about your average speed of your cell phone now, I would say is roughly, a 2 gigish range. So if you just want to relate it in terms of computer technology, just in the past 15 years, if we're talking about, PC technology, or we'll say 15 to 20 years of PC technology, computers have accelerated at an alarming rate. And now you start to see that acceleration die down. Of course, you start to see that. And the reasoning for it is because computers are no longer the norm in terms of how consumers go about doing their everyday computing. Although that might sound like a contradiction, it's true. You do your computing through your mobile device, or you do your computing through, a standalone device. So like, for example, I may, take my Samsung Galaxy Note 5 phone and take a picture of something and then upload it to Facebook. Well, I uploaded it to Facebook without needing a computer because the Samsung phone is the computer. In the same way, I can take my, digital camera and I can, photograph the same picture. And if I'm in a Wi-Fi network, I have the ability through my digital camera to go directly from camera to my social networking site, if that's what I want to do. Now, not all cameras can do this, and I want to point that out. So I don't want to make it sound like we're in a utopia where cameras can all take pictures, and all you got to do is walk into a hotspot area, and then you can just start flying pictures onto the web. I don't want to make it sound like that, but at the same time, just to give you reference of how far things have come, the computing that you do, whether it be through, desktop publishing or video editing or, photo editing or 3D design or whatever, it doesn't necessarily have to be done on a traditional desktop machine or even a laptop at this point in time. Now, I do want to make it clear that you're going to get certain advantages with an actual computer versus going with a standalone device. That you always have advantages that way. Whether it be, hey, I've got 1,000 pictures on here and I need to touch them up, or I need to downscale these images so that I can send them away online, what have you not. You're always going to have those kind of advantages. But the thing that I want to point out in this is that when you look at the advancements in technology, the ability to deal with people, places, and things in today's world in the way that you can, and to do it effortlessly at a whim. You think back to Kodak and Nikon when they developed that first digital camera, and Kodak didn't say it was going to work. You think all the way back then, and look at them now, and ask yourself, who made that mistake? Who made that mistake? I am a believer that in the end, when it comes to digital camera technologies, when it actually comes down to digital camera technologies, the last companies that will essentially be standing are the companies that can develop their own sensors, or they're companies that have sensor technology. I'm a firm believer in this, and I've always believed in this, and I believe that that's how it's going to eventually be. And the reasoning for it is your sensor development can make and break your company. Sony, for example. Sony, is the world's largest, currently right now anyways, they're considered to be the world's largest digital camera sensor-based manufacturer. And I believe it's the same way for camcorders too. But like, for example, when you buy a Samsung Galaxy phone, it has a Sony sensor in it. Depending on the iPhone you have, it may have a Sony sensor in it. When you buy a Nikon camera, it has a Sony sensor in it. When you buy a Pentax camera, normally it has a Sony sensor in it. When you buy a Fuji with their x-tran sensor, it's a collaboration between Fuji and Sony. That's what it is. And we could go on and on about what Sony's able to do as a manufacturer. Now, the reason why this is important is because of this. When you develop sensors, imaging sensors that is, when you develop imaging sensors, that gives you a lot of outlets to work from. To begin with, if you're selling your sensors in the way that Sony is, well, one of the advantages that you have is you don't have to necessarily make the camera sale. You just need to make sure that your clients are able to develop comprehensive lineups from a marketing perspective so that they can sell their cameras that actually have your sensor, or in this case, Sony sensor, in them. So sometimes, people will go into a retail store and, for example, they'll look at, a Nikon, a Canon, and a Sony. And, they may look at the three and they'll look at the Sony and go, well, Sony doesn't build cameras. I don't want them. And then they'll look at the Nikon, look at the Canon, and then they'll be like, you know what? Nikon, they have the best lenses on the market. I'm going to go with him. Now, in the end, Canon loses the sale and Sony loses the sale in this scenario. However, Sony realistically didn't lose a sale because they already made a sale with Nikon in order for Nikon to build that camera, because Nikon uses the Sony sensor. Now, if the scenario were to go where the consumer comes into the store and says, well, I'm going to buy the Sony because it's a smaller camera, or because it can shoot, umpteen frames per second, or because it has superior video when it comes to the Nikon or Canon, well, in the end, what does that mean? That means that Sony just made a bigger sale, technically, at that moment in time. So, the truth is, when consumers go to purchase their cameras, they go to purchase their cameras and they think, oh, well, I don't like Sony, for whatever experience that they've ever had with them, whether it was a bad receiver that they bought, maybe a TV crapped out on them, maybe they, bought into, I should say, bad marketing of a Sony camera. The truth is, sorry there, I had to step away for a second. But what I was wanting to say is, the truth is that you're going to, or not you're going to, but the truth is Sony's going to make some money one way or another. That's just how it works. So going back to what I was saying previously, the fact is a consumer can walk away from Sony for whatever reasons that they have that are heartfelt. But the reality is, from a camera perspective, in the camera arena, Sony has their hands in so many different things in the way of sensor, development and, other manufacturers creating imaging processors based on the concepts of, the Sony architecture, that it's really tough to actually get away from Sony as an actual consumer at this given point in time. Now, this bleeds into other scenarios. A great example of this would be if you were talking something that is more up-to-date and more current. For an example, would be something like drones. Okay, so one of the biggest brands out there, which is DJI, they just released their Phantom 3, or did an update to it, I should say, and they have their Inspire. And they use the Sony 4K sensor in order to, effectively do their video recording. That's what they use. They use a Sony 4K sensor. DJI may make a great drone, but they don't waste their time trying to figure out, hey, how do we sit up here and develop, camera imaging sensors? Now, the reason to why this is important is because what it does is it allows DJI to stay on top of what they believe they do best, which is develop drones, like the Phantom 3 or the Inspire or the Inspire 2, so on and so forth. Where companies like, for example, GoPro, you take them, and that kind of company, which deals primarily with action cams, is now starting to see their market erode, and they're wanting to get into the drone arena. Well, the problem is that GoPro has to effectively build a drone, and they have to further their sensor technology. And this is one of the key elements to why camera sensor technology is so crucial. Because when you develop camera sensor technology, what you're able to do is you're able to branch out. You're able to touch other revenue streams that you otherwise would not be able to do by building just the core product itself versus building an element of the core product, which is essentially what Sony does. And this is why I believe it's a really smart move. Now, the real reason to why we're effectively, having this conversation about sensor technology right now, or basically sensors and how they impact companies in terms of the camera market, is because it stems back to the conversations that we've had with Samsung. So we basically so far have had two conversations. One where we talked about, the 28 megapixel BSI sensor, and then the other one dealing with essentially their marketing and all of the above. And there's a lot of people who believe that Samsung is going to be wiped out of the camera market. Now, I'm not one of these people, okay? I don't believe that at all. I believe that Samsung might make a transformation, but the transformation that they have the potential of making is huge. And here's the reason why. Although Sony creates the greatest quantity of sensors out on the market, it is pretty clear they don't build the best sensors on the market. That is very clear. Like, for example, if you look at Fuji's x-tran sensor, all right, look at that sensor. That sensor literally just annihilates any other sensor that even comes within shooting distance of 16 megapixels to 24 megapixels. There's no comparison. Like, the x-tran sensor is by far the most resilient sensor, and it has consistently been the most resilient sensor for the past 4 years running, ever since the Fuji X Pro has come out. Now, some people will say, well, wait a minute, Doug, I've seen some tests where you've posted up the, TX, or I'm sorry, not TX, I always say TX, XT, there we go, where you've posted up the XT10 going head to head with like the Nikon D750. And for more or less, it looks like a wash, or depending on how you want to look at it, the Nikon D750 might look better if you're going for sharper resolution, so on and so forth. But what I would have to point out is this, is that in the test that I did, I gave the Nikon the benefit of the doubt that it would be using the same filtering system as the Fuji. And that's important to note in this conversation. So keep in mind, when you talk about the Nikon already starts off body only, we'll say roughly about 2,000-ish. Okay, body only, let's say 2,000-ish. Where the Fuji body is essentially $800. Okay, that's a big difference right there. $2,000 to $800. Number two, the software that you're talking about is another $200. So now the Nikon goes up to $2,200, where the Fuji is, effectively $1,000 now, simply because of that $200 in software cost that you'd be talking about. Then, in addition to that, you then start talking about whatever lens you want to put on there. Now, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to understand that at this point in the game, Fuji makes way better lenses on the baseline than Nikon does. There's no comparison there. Fuji has the superior lens quality. Fuji lenses definitely extend beyond a 16 megapixel system. Where with Nikon, what happens is, you sit up here and purchase, a full frame camera with some stock lens to it. And what happens is you end up getting a medium resolution lens. So what that means is that maybe your lens isn't designed for a true 24 megapixel. Maybe it's designed for a 16 megapixel, or maybe it's designed for a 20 megapixel, or, maybe it can pull off the 24 megapixel in terms of, the quote unquote sharpness and clarity. But the problem is that the lens lacks in terms of its f-stop or whatever the case may be. That, taking that lens that would probably be another 1,000 going on up, or if you wanted to be safer about it, let's say we go with a 24 to 70 millimeter lens, and let's say that that's roughly about 2 to 2,500. Okay, in that Nikon camera, you've essentially wrapped up, we'll say for the sake of the conversation, about 4,500 in that system. Where with the Fuji, you've got less than half of that wrapped up in that system. So if you want to take for the sake of the conversation here, Nikon D750 with a 24 to 70 millimeter 2.8 lens versus a Fuji XT10 with its 16 to 50 millimeter 2.8 lens, and you want them to go head to head, and then you want to throw, because in the Fuji's case you are going to have to put that interpolation software there to give it the fair resolutions to unlock its potential. It's going to walk all over the Nikon. That's what's going to happen. Most people are not going to sit up here and buy a Nikon camera with a 24 megapixel full frame sensor and say, yeah, I need to go get myself downscaling software so that I can get the max resolution out of this 24 megapixel system, or interpolation software, however you want to phrase it, or resizing software, or resolution software. But most people just don't do that. Okay? So the truth is, I do give the Nikon user the benefit of the doubt, but I know in a real world scenario, that's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. The Nikon is always going to fall short of the Fuji in a head-to-head matchup. It will always fall short because the Fuji user has the disposable income to get the $200 software and then batch convert all their photos through. And once when that happens, guess what? It's game over. There's nothing wrong with batch conversion. People do it all the time. Where with the Nikon user, you can't really do that because you've already tapped out at 4,500. So to sit up here and to throw another, 200 on top of the mix, it's like, it's just getting ridiculous here. If the camera was supposed to be as good as it was in the first place, you wouldn't be buying all of this extra in order to make it work. But again, what this does is this goes back to sensor technology. And what it goes back to is it goes back to the idea of you can buy a camera that is lesser than a full frame and get the optimal performance that can equal or surpass a full frame, which is one of the key notes here. Now, again, to why this is important is, in the end, when you make that Nikon or that Fuji sale, who wins? Well, if you buy the Nikon, it's who again? Nikon and Sony. They win. If you buy the Fuji, who wins? Nikon and... I'm sorry, not Nikon. If you buy the Fuji, it's Fuji and Sony. In other words, Sony can allow Nikon and Fuji to shoot each other up. It doesn't make a difference to them, because in the end, guess what? They're going to, cash in. They're going to cash in. Now, this can change over time, because keep in mind, the Fuji x-tran sensor is not solely made by Fuji. They get their core fundamental from Sony, and then they enhance the sensor, and that's what gives them the ability that they have, and that's why they're as good as they are. But this is something that relatively can change over time, where Fuji does acquire the ability to basically produce their own sensor, or they can go somewhere else. But again, we go back to Samsung. I don't want to lock them out of this conversation, because they are very important. And here's why they're important. Okay, so earlier, just a little bit ago, I had mentioned that I can see Samsung doing a transformation. I can totally see where Samsung says, hey, you know what? We're we're going to change our camera marketing from this over here to that over there. And what I mean by that is maybe they give up their point and shoot cameras. Maybe they give up those because God knows they ought to. And maybe they reinforce their cell phone division. Now, why would that be a critical move for Samsung? Well, here's why. Samsung now has the sensor technology that they need coming out of the NX system. So you got to think about this here. For a moment. A lot of people have written off Samsung because their lenses and their NX, system just couldn't sell in Germany. They say, they're pulling out of Germany. This is the end of Samsung and cameras, yada, 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 so on and so forth. Those people, I look at them and think they're pretty idiotic. Samsung is not going to just drop everything because they couldn't make it work in one country. There are reasons why they couldn't make it work in Germany. And quite frankly, if I were Samsung, I would have pulled out of Germany as well. I would have done that. And I'd probably pull out of every, Germanic speaking, country. I wouldn't even waste my time with it. Because that's not where your revenue streams are. What you do is you allocate your resources where they really do make sense. And for Samsung, they've already gained the prize that they needed to gain, which was the ability to create their own sensor. And that's what the 28 megapixel BSI speaks to. It speaks to the fact that they were able to develop their own sensor, and it speaks to the fact that Samsung can now go forward with what? What can they go forward with? They can go forward with producing BSI sensors into their own phone lineup. Now, again, think about what this means. Samsung had the ability with their BSI sensor to take a crop sensor and then literally project full frame performance. That's what they were able to do. That is exactly what they were able to do with it. Now imagine if Samsung were to take a scaled down version of their BSI sensor, pop it into a cell phone, and what would that do for the cell phone? Or what would it do for their cell phone division? Well, what it would do, which would be pretty obvious, is it would allow their cell phones in terms of image quality to reflect more of a classic point and shoot camera. That's what it would do. And why is that important? Well, the reason to why that's important is because Samsung is able to keep more of their revenues when it comes to phone production. That's why it's important. And who is Samsung not paying? Sony. See, one of the big mistakes that people have made in underestimating the Samsung NX system is that they haven't understood the main focus of what Samsung has been trying to go after, which is to develop an all-inclusive, a self-contained, a self-perpetuating system of development. Like, in other words, they went to Pentex, developed stuff with them, and what do? They walked away with how to actually build, or at least how to manufacture, I should say, a camera that is very intuitive. That's what Samsung came out of that with. I mean, Samsung by far has one of the most intuitive cameras you can possibly get on the market. Their menu system, their operational control, and everything is right there with Pentex. They know what they're doing there. Hands down, they are one of the most reliable that you're going to find in the market. But also now what they've done is they've been able to develop their own sensor technology, where effectively what they're able to do now is they're able to say, okay, you know what? Yeah, we've got the menu system down. We have the operational control set up down. But now what we have is we have the sensor technology. And through having that sensor technology, what they're able to do is they're able to spread it to other divisions. You know, they're able to distribute it in a way where for the 60 million phones they may sell this year alone, they save so much money in those given lineups if they wish to apply their sensor technology to those given phones. Now, I'm not going to say that from a point and shoot perspective, they can't revigorate that. They could definitely do that. I mean, essentially, they could use the same size sensor for their phone that they use for the point and shoot. It's just that I believe personally at this point in time, point and shoots have become so overly feature packed that image quality is just a secondary to it. And the whole idea behind selling a point and shoot is how much zoom can you give it? How small can you make it? Does the unit have Wi-Fi? Can the camera shoot in a burst mode? Is it easy to connect, the camera up to my phone if I'm going to download pictures through my phone and then send them offline? Because it has a crappy Wi-Fi system. Go figure. But this is where sensor technology comes into play. And this is why sensor technology is so critical. For Samsung specifically, their big advantage is now that they have sensor technology, they can distribute their sensor technology wherever they want to and to whoever they want to, if they want to do that. So you take brands like Pentax, you take brands like Fuji, you take brands like Nikon, and then you start looking at Samsung and you say, wait a second here, okay. So Samsung was able to develop a 28 megapixel sensor that clearly is superior to the Sony sensors that are out there, most of them anyways. And they're not going to charge us an arm and a leg. Why not go with it? If we can extrapolate just from the sensor processing ability itself, from a crop sensor, full frame performance, then again, why walk away from this kind of deal? And this is one of the greater challenges, that camera manufacturers face. Because in the end, when it comes to digital cameras, you only have a couple manufacturers that actually exist as legitimate manufacturers in the sense of being, self-sustaining. Samsung would now be one. I would technically say Fuji is is one you could look at. Panasonic, Olympus, and then, of course, Sony. Those are your main ones. Those are the ones that you get to look at and say, okay, these guys can hold their own in the market. The only other brand I didn't really, I don't think I mentioned was Canon. If I didn't mention them, then I'd mention them in that. But those are the ones that you would look at. But like your Nikon, your Pentax, you take those brands, or you take some of the other brands that are out there that are non-camera brands, but still deal in terms of video recording and stuff like that, and they are heavily dependent. And even though certain brands may have their own sensors, it doesn't mean they have the sensor type that's needed for that given area of the market. So, for example, Nikon, a while back, before Sony ended up buying Toshiba, Nikon went to Toshiba and they said, listen, we want you to develop a 24 megapixel sensor for us because Sony's not going to give us what we want in the way that we want it, and you guys seem like the way to go. So, of course, popped out the Nikon, D5200 and, the Nikon, so on and so forth, 7100 and all of the above. And this stuff looked really good up until you got to that full frame aspect. And when we're talking full frame, we're talking like the Nikon D4 series. And Nikon got itself in a situation where, it was like, oh crap, we probably really didn't think this out. Granted, we were able to use Toshiba for our 24 megapixel sensor lineup, but the problem that we're being faced with now is we're being faced with the fact that for our full frame lineup, Toshiba doesn't seem to do the quote-unquote job that we were expecting them to be able to do. So with Nikon, they basically had to go back to Sony and say, look, you know what? It is true, we kind of sever ties with these, given camera models over here, but we could definitely use your sensors in these other areas over here. And hence, that's where you get cameras like, the Nikon DF. I mean, that thing, the full frame camera that runs like $3,000, or it used to when it debuted, that couldn't record any video, but it had the same image quality as the, Nikon, D4, that whole thing. But that's where that camera comes out of. And then, of course, there was like, the Nikon J1 series, so on and so forth, where, Nikon again had to go to Sony because they needed essentially like a 1-inch sensor or whatever. And they found that it was much, much harder to work with Toshiba on those kind of, deals than it was to, go to Sony and say, listen, we need to have this from you so we can have an upstanding model in the market. So, to a degree, you have a back and forth. And that back and forth really does dictate exactly how a camera manufacturer is able to thrive. So sometimes what will happen is, consumers will look at a camera manufacturer, like Pentax, for example, and they'll ask themselves, how in the world does this company survive? Like, its sales are not nearly as robust as Nikon and Canon, but how is it that they're able to hang in there? And the reason why they're able to hang in there is because they're not burning R&D on sensor technology. What they're doing is they're merely creating an imaging processor to work with the sensors that they're given to maximize the performance. And this is why cameras like the Fuji, X Pro 2 are so insanely anticipated. Because Fuji has been taking the past 4 years essentially perfecting the Sony 24 megapixel system in the form of an x-trans unit. That's what they've been doing. Unless Fuji decided to get the sensor from somebody else, which they just haven't disclosed yet. So for all we know, Fuji could be getting the sensor from Samsung, although I doubt they would, based on what one of their executives said about Samsung and their 28 megapixel system. Fuji could be getting it from Philips, for example. Again, though, I doubt that they would do that because I don't think Philips really has the technology at this point to compete with Sony in terms of overall camera sensor capability. Fuji could be getting their sensor from, Kodak. Although, again, I would doubt that, simply because Kodak tends to be, a little out there when it comes to sensor production. But, my point is this, is that you have camera manufacturers that are really good at adapting, and they're so good at adapting that they end up transforming the sensor itself that they're given, like Fuji. And this is why Fuji is a sensor manufacturer. They're able to take a Sony XMAR-R sensor or an XMAR sensor, whichever one it is, and they're able to flip it on its head and say, nope, this is what it's going to be now. And this gives them a lot of, push in the market. But it's also one of the reasons to why they don't have to spend insane amount insane amounts of cash trying to effectively, pivot to developing a sensor and then lacklustering everything else. In fact, if you talk about Fuji for a moment and how it all worked out for them, you will recall they went a couple years without producing any SLR. After the Fuji Pro 5, was done, and that's back when they had used a Nikon mount. Fuji just said that, yep, we're gonna come out with a compact camera. We don't know when it's gonna be, but it will happen. And it was some years. In fact, honestly, leading up to the X series cameras, for point and shoots, that was like the golden age for Fuji, if you guys recall. It was the golden age. That's where, Fuji was coming out with, compact, point and shoots that had some of the best results on the market in terms of focusing, in terms of, the zooms and all that kind of stuff there. Now, granted, they weren't perfect. Okay, let's not kid ourselves. They weren't perfect cameras. But they were good enough for what was currently in the market. Because the only real brand that could compete with Fuji at that point in time with their, super CCD or their, pixel shift capabilities or whatever we'd be talking about, was Sony. They were the only real brand that was capable of doing so, and that, made a huge difference in Fuji as a brand, and it's what carried them over. So the thing that you got to remember with Fuji is they started off as a pure sensor manufacturer with like their super CCD. And then they went to, their, shall we say, super CMOS sensor or whatever it was. I can't even remember now what it was. And then what they did is they jumped into the x-tran bit, but the reason to why they did that was because Fuji understood the cost. They understood that the battle was not in developing necessarily the sensor per se, as it was taking something that was mass marketable, low in cost, and then squeezing the utmost performance out of the sensor. And this is why the x-tran system has been so successful for Fuji. This is another reason why Fuji is able to build things at such low prices. So, when Fuji, in the way that they do it, they take a baseline Sony sensor of 16 megapixels. Keep in mind, that 16 megapixel sensor that Fuji's using is the same 16 megapixel sensor that was in the Pentax, K5, the Pentax K5 II, the Sony NX5, the Sony, well, actually, they had a couple NX5s, like their NX5T and all that other stuff. Okay, but all those Sony NX units, it's the same 16 megapixel sensor that was in the Nikon D7000. It's fundamentally the same sensor. So where Fuji is a very smart manufacturer is that they look at the reality and they say, well, wait a moment here. Let's wait here. If we can take the sensor that is the most widely distributed sensor out on the market, which will give us a lower cost in terms of sensor production, and then if we re-engineer it to what we want it to be with our imaging processor, then the game's afoot. And that's what has made Fuji so successful. Now you see Fuji essentially reiterating this concept with, of course, none other than the Fuji X2 Pro. Now, I have to say, I think, now that I think about it, that Fuji has by far got to be like the smartest camera company out on the market right now. And you got to think about what they're doing. Like literally, think about what they're doing. They're going to Sony and saying, listen, we want your 24 megapixel sensor. Or they're going to somebody and saying, we want your 24 megapixel sensor. The 24 megapixel sensor at this point in time is technically the most widely distributable sensor on the market. Okay, and what I mean by that is, think of all your Nikon models that have 24 megapixel sensors. So you have the Nikon D, you got the 3100, you got the 3200, you got the 3300, you have the 7100, the 7200. You've got the 52. You've got the 53. You've got the 55. You know, just think about all those cameras I just rattled off. You know, just think about it. All those cameras I just rattled off. We didn't sit up here and talk about, you know, the Pentax K5, the Pentax K5 II, the Pentax, you know, I'm sorry, they don't use that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. The Pentax K3, there we go. The Pentax K3 II, that's what I meant to say. Okay, you got those. You know, you have those that use a 24 megapixel sensor as well. And then, of course, you know, you got some other obscure manufacturers out there using 24 megapixel sensors in the way that they want to. And then, of course, you got Sony. And don't forget, with Sony, you have, like, what? The Sony A65, the Sony, like, A77, the A77 Mark II. I think Sony's coming out with a like an A68. Some craziness there. You know, like, these are all the cameras that use the Sony 24 megapixel sensor, essentially. And they use it in one form or another. Either they were used from Sony directly, or they were used by Toshiba, and then Sony purchased Toshiba, and now it's Sony anyways. So you see how this benefits Fuji from their perspective. They merely look at the reality and say, you know what, 24 megapixels is the way to go. Now, Fuji isn't stupid about this. I mean, they're pretty smart. They look at it and say, hold on here, we know 24 megapixels isn't all that it's cracked up to be. We know this because we were using a 16 megapixel sensor that surpassed a 24 megapixel sensor. In addition to that, 16 megapixel sensors are dirt cheap at this point in time. So what does Fuji do? They say, here's the difference of what we're going to do with this 24 megapixel sensor versus the 16 megapixel sensor we have, in order to ensure that people move in the right direction with us and not move in the wrong direction and get stuck in their ways. So to begin with Fuji, with the 24 megapixel sensor, it uses a brand new imaging processor that is vastly superior to their previous one, number one. Number two, what you have is you have greater dynamic range, greater noise control. So literally, the Fuji 24 megapixel sensor versus the 16 can do a 12,000 ISO at 24 megapixel sensor capability versus the 16 only doing a 64, and the ISO performance is so much better. It is so much more detail oriented at the 24 megapixel sensor setup than at the 16 megapixel sensor setup. But the other thing I'm going to point out is this. Fuji actually, with the 24 megapixel sensor, does lossless data. That's what they do. They have a RAW file that is lossless data. In other words, if the camera can see it, technically it's recording it. That's what it's doing. Or at least they claim. They claim that their RAW files now, you have the option of lossless data. And that is huge. So now you have, like the Fuji x-tran sensor, what separates it from other sensors in the beginning is that the x-tran sensor can take in up to 8 times the information of a conventional Sony sensor. That's huge. Now apply that concept to your RAW file. Now, does this mean that every Fuji RAW file that is a 24 megapixel, a 24 megapixel, camera is going to have RAW files that are 8 times greater than, your conventional 24 megapixel sensors from Sony and everybody else? The answer is no. No, that's not what I'm saying, and that's not what it means, and that's not what's going to happen. They're not. I don't think they're that nice. I'll put it that way. And on top of that, even if you could take in and basically harnessed 8 times the information, to a degree, you'd have a lot of pointlessness simply because of the cutoff points. Like in other words, based on the image that you have, you're going to have certain cutoff points where it just wouldn't make any sense to have that data. That data would be non-applicable. Therefore, the camera would be smart enough to simply cut it off. But the whole idea is that Fuji is going to WinRAR it. And what that means in plain English is, look, you know what? We are going to give you non-compressed headroom for editing your photos. Again, this is one of the big advantages to having a sensor-based manufacturer. So you end up in a very interesting scenario when it comes to Fuji. It's a very, very, very nice scenario, I would say, for those who have invested in the x-tran sensor thus far. But I'll even go further than that and say Fuji, even setting the 24 megapixel x-tran sensor aside, Fuji has already developed a noiseless sensor that they've touted. They just don't want to use it. Now, why they don't want to use this thing is beyond me, except for the fact they're holding back for when either they decide to break down and do full frame, which we'll get into here in a second, or, they just don't want to do it until they start shooting 4K or 8K or 16K or whatever craziness they come out with on the video end. I mean, that might be when they decide to release this sensor. Because the whole point is that you want to market the sensor with something that really pertains to you. Now, full frame. Let us talk about that for a moment, because I want to be fair about that. And the reason to why I want to be fair about this is that I don't want people walking away thinking, okay, all Doug is doing is he's up here talking about these effective compact sensors from manufacturers who build, cameras, and don't get compact sensor confused with compact camera. Okay, although I guess technically a compact camera at this day and age can't use a compact sensor. But anyways, he's not addressing full frame. So why doesn't he address full frame? Well, here's the reason why. And you got to take it for what it's worth. All right. And I'm just going to spill it out, out on the floor here for everyone to basically saturate in. And I did say spill. I didn't say spell. I said spill. So here's what you're going to, essentially begin to saturate here on, which is full frame is not the end all be all. It's not. I mean, just flat out, it's not. And if you think it is, then I'm sorry, you've been living a lie. Since cameras such as, I want to say the Pentax K20D, which handily was able to defeat the Canon, 5D, the first one, since the Pentax K20, I'm sorry, not the K20, but the K5 II and the K5 IIS, and those were able to easily match, the Canon 5D Mark III, and I've notated that, and that's been recognized by many now. But even if we were to sit up here and look at the Canon 5D Mark II, which is acclaimed as the greatest, Canon full frame of all time by many, and I think that's based on purely the fact they couldn't afford higher end Canon models. Because personally, I like the Canon. I like Canon's, higher end full frames are used to, anyways. But anyways, the Pentax K5 was able to defeat that, and that was my first video. My point to what I'm going after here and what I'm trying to tell you guys is this, is that when it comes right down to it, full frame is a myth. It is a total honest myth when it comes to sensor production. And to be perfectly honest with you, this is part of what Canon's problem is that they're perpetuated in a myth. They're in a self-perpetuated myth. That if they just go full frame, and if they just keep hitting the full frame harder and harder and harder, they're going to win it out. That's what they believe. Now, you might be wondering, why did I simply just mention Pentax this entire time and I didn't mention Fuji? To begin with, yeah, Fuji will essentially annihilate anything Canon has from an image quality standpoint, okay? X Pro 2 or not. Just their, XT1 or their XT10 or their XE2 or what will be their XE2S, those cameras can easily, all right, and handedly serve Canon, their head on a platter. That's not, I don't even think that's up for a debate. As far as that goes, it's not for a debate. Well, it is for a debate that I'd love to have with somebody, but it's just not going to be right now. Because I do have debates with people, and I say, hey, let's look at this, boom, 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 and then they're like, oh, I didn't know that, and I'm like, yeah, you should have checked before you opened up your mouth. But the reason why I use Pentax as the marker is because of this, because a lot of it deals with marketing. Okay, it deals with marketing, and Pentax is an amazing brain when it comes to marketing, because they think long term and they know what they're doing. Okay, so Pentax came out with their K5 series, and their K5 series has essentially worked really well for them. Like their 5.2, their 5.2S, and now you have the Pentax, the K3. Okay, they have a K3 series out. Now, the K3 is not the same thing as the K5, and I want to be clear about that, and I want to say it's not the same performer, but it's not meant to be, and here's the reason why. So, Pentax figured out that regardless of the full frame myth, people still want to have full frame. So they said, well, why don't we sit up here and just build a medium format and call it a day? And that's what they did. So they came out with, their Pentax like 645 medium format camera. They had version 1, which did like a 1600 ISO, 40 megapixels. And that was okay. Used a CCD sensor, and that was that. And that debuted at 9,000. Then, lo and behold, it dropped down to essentially like 5,000 when they came out with their, 645Z or whatever they call the thing, okay? And that dropped the other unit down half in price, and that unit was the $9,000 model. But after the Christmas season, latter Christmas season, like a year or two later, what happened was the $9,000 model dropped down to 6,000, and of course, you can imagine where the 40 megapixel model is right now. Just go check it out online, and you can figure that part out for yourself. But here's my point to it, okay? And here's why I'm bringing this up. It shows how smart Pentax is as a manufacturer that may not produce a sensor, but understands sensor technology. So what Pentax did with the sensor was this, is they said, listen, we're going to take a crop sensor, 16 megapixels, and we're going to make it match Canon's 20 whatever megapixel full frame. We're going to do that. That is undisputable. Bam. And that's exactly what they did. Then they came out and said, okay, you know what? We're going to now acquire a full frame, or not a full frame sensor, I'm sorry. We're going to now acquire a medium format sensor, and we're going to set the ceiling so you can't go any higher than what normally would be determined by the camera market. So, bam, they did that right there. So, effectively, when it came to Canon and when it came to Nikon, what Pentax did was they created an artificial floor with their K5-2 set that said, your image quality better not drop below here, because if it does, we're going to eat it alive. And that's exactly what happened with Pentax. Then what happened was they came out with a medium format model that said, hey, guess what? Your image quality better not exceed here, because if it does, in terms of pricing and whatnot, you're going to get up into our range, which is clearly a superior system. So what it's done between the compact sensor and the medium format sensor is it's really restricted. It's really restricted the full frame market. And again, this is really important to understand, to why I'm not really big on full frame. Because full frame has been defeated generation after generation after generation after generation. And in addition to that, it's been boxed in the past, I would say, 2 to 3 generation of cameras. If you're talking from a yearly cycle perspective. If you're talking like every 6 months, then we'll say 3 to 6 generations. More importantly than that, though, after having the success that they've had with their medium format unit, Pentax said, you know what? Let's give that full frame system a try. Now, why do I, why do I look at full frame and say it's more of a myth? It's because Pentax at this point is just building a full frame camera to build a full frame camera to say, hey, look, you know what, Nikon and Canon? All these years when you were taught that full frame nonsense, we have our compact sensors, which can definitely take you on. We got a medium format sensor, which, hate to break it to you, you're not beating that. And by the way, we can build what you've got too, if you really want it to be like that. So we can jump into the hot tub right with you. And that's really what you have going on here, is you have a scenario where, quite frankly, when it comes to full frame and when it comes to the overall sensor market, full frames do not hold as much clout as a lot of people would believe. They don't. Because you have newer technologies that come out that simply supersede full frames at the cost that they're at. Now, I don't want to make this whole conversation or the rest of it about full frames. I just want to give you perspective on it. Okay? And again, just think about the last 3 episodes that you've listened to. And the third one being this one, okay? We talked about the Samsung NX1 BSI sensor, which is a crop sensor, which clearly can match full frame. We talked about the Fuji x-tran sensor, which is a crop sensor that can fully match full frame. Now, when you get to Pentax and their K3, because a lot of people are going to go, well, Doug, the K3 is, part of Pentax's main assortment. You can't look at the K3 / the K3 II and then say that they don't perform as well as full frame. Therefore, you don't count them in the lineup. No, I do count them in the lineup, but under a different edict, because they serve a completely different purpose, which let me get into right now. So, Pentax, again, not a dumb company, realizes we can't develop sensors. We're not going to do that. We're going to let Sony develop sensors, and then we're gonna do what we want to do with them. So Pentax is now taking the Fuji route. Okay, where they're saying, hey, you know what? Yeah, we're not going to develop our own sensors, but if you give us a sensor, we're going to make it what we want it to be. We're going to do that. And Pentax took another page out of Fuji's book, which is called Sensor Shift. So the way it works with Sensor Shift is effectively Pentax utilizes the Sony sensor in a way, or they utilize it in a way where they shift the positioning of the pixels on the sensor through a shifting process that I'm not going to get into heavily here in this conversation, that allows for the sensor to deliver through the imaging processor different results. Now, these results can deal with sharper resolution. These results can deal with better noise control. These results can deal with better dynamic range and, better coloring. These results can deal with, a higher resolution if they want to. The fact is, when you talk about pixel shift, you can make it work any which way you want to. And this is how it essentially works for Pentax as a brand. And this is one of the reasons to why Pentax has taken up basically the Fuji ideology of saying, hey, guess what? We've got pixel shift now. Yay, yay, fun, fun. And this is how it's going to work for us. So Pentax says, look, we're going to do the Fuji thing too, but we're going to do it our own way. We're We're basically going to, take a sensor that Sony makes, and we are going to modify the sensor so that it is a marketable sensor, which is the key thing that Pentax has now come to realize. The reason to why, in short, the K5 II is not the same thing as the K3 is very simple. And I'm talking the K3 too when I talk about pixel shift technology, is because the K5 II, as great as it was, or the K5 IIs, as great as it was, did not have a marketable sensor. And if you can't market your sensor, then what good is your camera? Like, seriously. What's the number one thing that you market when you market a camera? You market its sensor. That's what you do. The Pentax K3, and where it comes out ahead, is that they're able to market pixel shift technology with the 24 megapixel sensor. So it's not just any old 24 megapixel sensor. Why, it uses pixel shift. And it does it the right way. Now, there have been other companies, such as Fuji, who was the first really big brand when it came to pixel shift. There are other companies, such as Nokia, that have their own form of pixel shift. And, of course, there is Pentax that has it, too. And I know some people may be listening to this, and they're going to be shouting, Doug, what about Olympus? What about Olympus? What about Olympus? Calm down. Olympus gets its own day. All right? It's going to get its own day. So Pentax has this ability. They have this ability, which is a really nice ability, that allows them to market their sensor with their camera while taking a very common sense approach. Now, there is one flaw to marketing pixel shift for Pentax, which is the sensor itself is not shifting its pixels while staying in a native position. That's not how it works. So effectively, it's more mechanically based than it is sensor based. And this is why I think, honestly, Pentax is now willing to build a, full frame camera in many respects. It's because mechanically they have found the golden bullet or the silver bullet. But I think it's more golden in this case because it's a full frame that we'd be talking about next. Silver bullet is basically the K3. The golden bullet would be their full frame model, which we're going to have a discussion on that. Heck, that might even be our next episode. But, when you talk about, sensor distribution and stuff like that, manufacturers really do have to make a choice. And that choice normally entails, do you just have a sensor that is just a sensor, which is like what Nikon does? And this is one of Nikon's bigger problems. One of the reasons why Nikon really doesn't fare well in terms of, sensor technology, is large in part due to the fact that their imaging processors suck. I think they're on to the Speed 5 now with their Nikon D5 and their Nikon D500. And it's going to be some, exclusive processor currently to those cameras that is supposed to exhibit some greater capability than before. Mind you, the cameras aren't doing a 24 megapixel now. They're going to be doing a 20 megapixel. And of course, the argument to that is, well, sports photographers want to have smaller file sizes. So what do? You just lower the megapixels. That's what you do. That's what you do. You lower the megapixels. And that's how they get their smaller file size, which to me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't, the fact is you're buying a camera based on its speed and image quality, correct? So if the whole idea is that you're going to build a 20 megapixel sensor system for a smaller file size, that would be the dumbest idea ever, because why wouldn't you just build a 16 megapixel system, which has been around forever, and go with that smaller file size? You know, or why not go with a 14? Or why not go with a 12? You guys get my point to what I'm talking about here. So, to my point with Nikon is this. They're not building a 20 megapixel sensor because they want a smaller file size. That's just a total load of bunk. Whoever talks that stuff is just they're imagining things in their own world. They're doing a 20 megapixel sensor system because they want to have better image quality. That's what it is. That's exactly what it is. Nikon has seen the reality. They know as a fact that, hey, Fuji at 16 megapixels wants the living crap out of us at a 24 megapixel. Heck, even the Pentax KS2, which is like 500 and some bucks, it's a 20 megapixel sensor. That thing utterly destroys like the Nikon D7200, which is twice its price. Or we go back to the whole original concept of a Pentax K5 II, which is 16 megapixels, and how it whomped the Canon 5D Mark III full frame, which is like 20 plus megapixels. In the world of sensors, Nikon is now starting to understand that, hey, our imaging processors aren't the best out there. They clearly aren't the best out there. That's why we keep getting beat by lesser manufacturers in terms of market share. But somehow they're able to match what we have or exceed what we have. So what they're now trying to do is they're trying to say, let's scale back on the pixels. Let's see what advantages we can crank out of a brand new dedicated imaging processor. And of course, a brand new lower res sensor, and work from there. And that's what's happening. So, you know, again, I find it very interesting when you start talking about the marketing of sensors and stuff like that, because I think it's really important that you understand. You know, Samsung is on the rise. They're up here saying, oh, no. Here's what you do. You oversample your sensor capability, and then what you do is you get a downscaling, or a downscaling resolution program that maximizes the image quality of your sensor. That's what they believe. You got Fuji, on the other hand, who says, no. Here's what you do. You're going to shoot at a lower resolution, then natively have the sensor maximize on noise control, dynamic range, and all of the above. And then you can use a, upscaling resolution program in order to maximize your image quality to go toe-to-toe with any other manufacturer out there. That's what they believe. Okay? Then you have Fuji now saying, well, you can still do that, but we've now got a newer model where you can just shoot at a native 24 that technically can go all the way up to a 36. That's what it should be able to do. But we also can put lossless data in there too. Lossless data. That means that you're not going to, quote unquote, interpolate or artificially enhance data for the sake of the conversation, depending on how you feel about that kind of concept. But what you're going to do is just reposition data where it makes more sense, and you're going to get a truer, image. So that's them on a side note with their X Pro 2. But then you've got, Pentax, who says, wait a second here. No. You guys got it all wrong. You got to go with a high-res sensor, and what you got to do is you mechanically have to apply the sensor so you can get the most out of it, hence pixel shift. So when you want to have that better dynamic range, well, you choose the dynamic range setting and allow the, sensor to do a multi-shot system that allows for greater dynamic range. You want sharper resolution. Then mechanically, through the sensor that you're given, with a multi-shot system, produce sharper resolution. Or if you want better noise control, you use the same system and you get better noise control. The pick is yours. Go right ahead and choose whatever one you want. It's just like it's like the McDonald's menu system or whatever, but that's what they believe. But then you have Nikon, who is basically like, you know what? Yeah, we're going to have to go to a 20 megapixel system. We can't do this 24 anymore. It's not really working the way we expected it to. We've seen the results. We now understand that we're not going to be able to, quote unquote, supersede other manufacturers in image quality. So we have to go to something that's more manageable for us to get the better image quality that we believe we need to have to sustain ourselves in the market. And there's Nikon. Now, I will point out this. We haven't talked a lot about Canon in this episode. And the one thing you want to keep in mind, Canon for the longest was saying 18 megapixels, 18 megapixels, 18 megapixels. They were the odd ones out in all of this 18 megapixel deal, They knew 24 was just straight up stupid. And they knew 16 was too low. So they went with the 18 megapixels deal. And we're not going to really get into the Canon conversation today, because I think that it basically does own its own episode. And it might have 2 or 3 episodes for all I know. But what I want to say is this, is resolution-wise, it's kind of funny. Canon is now trying to bump up their resolutions to around a 24 megapixel to now look relevant in today's market. Although it's like a 20 to 24-ish that they're really aiming for right now. Nikon is now trying to drop down to 20. So basically, Canon and Nikon are essentially trying to meet each other. They're trying to meet each other in the middle there. They're trying to, and I just find that utterly amazing. But for those of you who wonder, why haven't we talked a lot about Canon in this episode today? And let me explain it to you. Canon, although they do produce their own sensors, their sensors do lack the performance that they should have due to the fact that the Digix processor is just so out of date. Just real quick to give you guys reference, the way Canon builds their cameras, or the way they have been building their cameras is they have a class of Digix processor, whether it's a Digix 4, a Digix 5, a Digix 6, or a Digix 7, or a Digix 5000, I don't know, but they have different Digix processors, okay? Each Digix processor is designed to be able to process so many megapixels. That's how it works, so many megapixels. The Digix 5 technically should be able to process about 20 megapixels. However, I believe in the 5D Mark III, they had to give it dual Digix imaging processors. I'd have to go back and recheck that. But the bottom line to it is they've had to do that before. So, like, in other words, the way it works with Canon is this. Like, their Canon 7D. Not 7D Mark II, but 7D. When they came out with that camera, which was like an 18 megapixel camera, the Digix processor that they had in it was so inefficient that they had to use dual imaging processors. Okay? One of the reasons to why I'm not talking about Canon right now is, before I have that episode, I would actually have to go back and brush up on my Canon knowledge of the processors, because it's very just really in depth in the way that you have to look at it, and there's a lot of math in it, and the bottom line is, in the end, it still equals to failure. Okay, it does. I'm just going to tell you the truth. It equals to failure. And also, Canon has a methodology of saying, okay, we know that with our Digix 4 processor, we can't go past 14 megapixels. So in order to ensure that the image quality of a Rebel never hits a D series or never hits a full frame Mark series, what we will do is we will give it 18 megapixels. That's what we'll do. This way, Digix 4 plus 18 megapixels equals crap. Okay? Same way in terms of the Digix 5. Okay, so the Digix 5 can only do, we'll say for the sake of the conversation, 18 megapixels. All right? But the key to the Digix 5 is, in order for it to really be able to hunker down on that image quality, you effectively need two imaging processors. So if you've only got one, then your image ends up looking like crap compared to other manufacturers. And if you end up having two, then you got a fighting chance. And that's why we really didn't talk about Canon here, because I wasn't trying to make the conversation about imaging processors. We're going to have another episode for that. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to basically give you guys a kind of roundabout way of, sensors and how they impact the market. Sensors are huge in how they impact the market. And again, let us go back to Sony one more time. Sony owns, somewhere in between 50 to 60% easily of the sensor market. They're able to do whatever they want to do. And you have these manufacturers that take their sensor and they apply it in different ways and get these different results. And, the thing is, these manufacturers aren't using necessarily dual imaging processors. These manufacturers aren't trying to set the cameras up where, the sensor exceeds the capabilities of the imaging processor. Hence, this is why you end up with real crappy image quality, like in the way that you would with a, Canon T5 or a Canon T5i or a Canon SL1 or a Canon, 70D or a Canon 7D or a Canon, 70D Mark, or 7D Mark II. You just don't know. These other manufacturers aren't doing that. Like, listen, I'm not a huge Nikon fan. You guys should have already been able to tell by the way that I talk about Nikon. But Nikon's definitely better than Canon is when it comes to image quality at this point in the game. I'd be the first one to sit up here and say that. I think anybody who would be looking at Canon and trying to make that connection when it comes to sensor technology, it's just not there. Because for them, it's not wrapped up in the sensor. It's wrapped up in the imaging processor. And their biggest problem is they don't have the imaging processor capability at this given point in time to truly utilize the sensors that they have. Now, arguably, you can make the argument about Nikon as well, which I've already said. That is their issue too. But there's a huge difference. Nikon still, at this point, I would look at them and say they have a quote-unquote status quo that is met. They have that. They've got a status quo that is met. Like, in other words, they've recognized that Pentax has made the ground that they've made. They've recognized Fuji's made the ground that they've made, so on and so forth. And through the Xpeed, 3 to the 4 and now to the 5, they've been able to begin to close that gap. And that's what I have to say about it. They've closed that gap to a meaningful extent. But I'm going to tell you what, Canon hasn't even come close. The Canon, all you got to do is look at the Canon 5D Mark III. The Canon 5D Mark III, which is technically a good camera, is just out of date. It's vastly out of date, and it's vastly outperformed by other cameras in the market. So for example, if I were to take, a Samsung NX1 and put it up against a Canon 5D Mark III, the Samsung NX1, from a performance standpoint, just sheer mechanical performance standpoint, is going to murder the Mark III. There's just no two ways about it. Then on top of that, when you start looking at image quality, surface quality from about a 3200 ISO, I'll say 1600 ISO going forward, it's all going over to the Samsung. You want to talk about, a 32, I'd say it evens out in the end based on, dynamic range exposure and all the like. 64 going forward, sure, I'll give it to the Canon 5D, Mark III. I'll totally do that. But, and here's where the but comes in, look at how much you spend on them. You want to buy a Canon 5D Mark III, that's $2,500. Then you want to sit up here and buy a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. You want to do that business? Okay, yeah. I'm sorry, not a 70 to 200, but a 24 to 70. That's what I meant to say. 24 to 70, millimeter lens, 2.8. That's another. You might as well just say, $2,500. So that's like $5,000 right there. You're gonna wrap up $5,000 in that thing. Samsung, I can get the same kind of setup, 16 to 50. For, which is a 2 to 2.8 for $2,500. Let's get real about this, guys. We got to get real at some point. This goes back to what I said about full frame and why I'm not a big fan of full frame, is because there's always a compact sensor out there within about a 6-month time frame that seems to just smack it down, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And what you end up finding yourself doing is you end up trying, or I'm sorry, when you get into camera conversations with people who know about camera sensor technology and who understand camera systems, more importantly, you end up in a situation where you end up trying to defend full frame. Like, I've met a lot of people that have tried to defend full frame against me, and they fall like dominoes. They're my funnest debates. They are. And in the end, they concede. And in the end, heck, half the time, they end up purchasing what I was talking about anyways, which is funny in and of itself, because I'm not making any money off it. But that's that. So, guys, that's going to be the episode for today. And, I'm not sure what we're going to do for the next episode. We're going to do something fun, though. We'll do something fun like what we did here. But anyways, you guys take care. Until next time, all right, bye-bye.